Thank you. It's a pleasure. Just want to make sure this works. Yeah, it does. Okay. So the question might be, why do you have a native English speaker on the Slovak group right before lunch? That's the most dangerous slot, the slot between the participants and their lunch. I am Slovak and I am Hungarian, so I can say za chvíľu bude obed and miles večerara. So I have both of that in my blood. The reason I'm here and not in the United Kingdom is because I have kids and I don't want them growing up in the United Kingdom. And the purpose of this presentation is not to say, oh, what a horrible place the UK is. It's to say, let's not be the UK. Let's learn from the experiences of the UK. So this first slide here is one of my heroes, kind of the father intellectually of the counter Reformation, Erasmus, who said that the main hope of a nation lies in the proper education of its youth. And you can take that all the way back to ancient Greece and Aristotle, who said, give me a child until he's the age of 7 and I'll show you the man. I always loved philosophy. And I studied philosophy in university. My father said, you don't make money as a philosopher. There's no philosophers anymore. And I'm a lawyer now, so there's truth in that. But we underestimate the role of philosophy in our society, in our culture. Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, came up with an amazing therapy called logotherapy, and it speaks to us today. It's about the crisis of meaning and the lack of meaning we have in our lives today. And it's ironic that we even inherited from our parents and grandparents who lived through socialism and wars. We've inherited peace, prosperity, free time. We've developed amazing things like social media, but through that social media and through that ability and that free time to think about things. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-month-old. I don't have time to think, but our young people have time to think, and they think too much, and they lack meaning. And the philosophies that we have had in the last few decades have been troublesome. We had Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism, which taught us that the whole purpose of life is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So the best interests of a child, or an adult for that matter, are their ability to enjoy things. Dignity for Catholics, for Christians, means something different than what it means for other people in the world who are secular. We've had the rise of the religion of tolerance. The fact that you have to now respect everyone, take them as they come, no matter what they believe or what craziness comes out of them. I remember I was doing a television debate in the United Kingdom, and the way those are done, whether it's the BBC or whatever, they bring you on camera last minute. And so you often don't see who you're debating against. And I was debating the mainstreaming of LGBT education into the UK school system. And I sit down and I see that the gentleman sitting beside me, who identifies as a Muslim, is also wearing lipstick, which is an odd combination if you think about it. And with that ideology of tolerance, we must take him as he is. I have to say, this is a good-looking crowd. The women are wearing lipstick, not the men. So it's just a sign of the times of where a culture can go. You had postmodernism and cultural Marxism. So this dismantling of the Judeo-Christian structures that maintain society. And so now we live in a time where sexual attraction is immutable. You're born with it and it can't change. But biological identity is fluid. You could be anywhere along the spectrum of your gender depending on what's in your head. A woman is not defined by her chromosomes, but by the fact that she believes she's a woman regardless of those chromosomes. And family becomes anything we want it to be. And that's problematic. Solzhenitsyn, in the Gulag Archipelago, said that there's no such thing as a bad guy with a black cowboy hat riding and doing evil things. Ideologies start with a kernel of truth and a good intention. And such was the case in the United Kingdom. And just to stick with the Russian writers, I do enjoy them. Solokhov and his book, And Quiet Flows the Dawn, which is about the rise of how Bolshevism made it into the Don Cossack regime and how quickly that spread through Russia, allowing for what happened in 1917 and following to happen. And we're not living in those revolutionary times, but we are living in revolutionary times as well. And, you know, I think in a place like the UK, they're trying to build a kingdom, but they don't want God in it. And so we go from something like this, Section 28 of the Local Government Act, Margaret Thatcher before she was Prime Minister, and she was a giant among giants in the times of Ronald Reagan, who has a statue here in the city, Brian Mulroney from my home country, Canada, Helmut Kohl, truly a land of giants at an incredible time. When she was Secretary of State for Education, she passed this law before she was Prime Minister, and it says that a local authority, that's the body that overlooks the maintained schools in England and Wales, shall not intentionally promote homosexuality and publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school, which means a school that's funded by the government, of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Now, only 15 years later, after this was repealed in 2003, this became the most toxic, most spoken about provision in English law. And in 2018, they introduced something called relationships and sex education. And so you go from Section 28 to this. This is the Department of Education. This is a picture I took myself when I went to visit them to speak about what their new relationships and education, sex education curriculum was going to look like. If you sent an email to someone at the Department for Education at that time, this is the email signature you'd get back. So sex and relationships education was made mandatory in England and Wales, and eventually, in a more extreme form, if that's even possible, in Scotland, and Northern Ireland is just doing it now. But in England, and in England at least, it made relationships education mandatory in primary schools and secondary schools. So from kids as young as reception, we're getting this education. It was now mandatory also in independent schools. So you were required to teach this regardless of whether you were receiving state money. It was something that the inspectorate was going to grade you on, and it became something where the government, and it was a conservative government nonetheless. Now, there's a Labour government now. They're doing some crazy things. They're trying to get assisted suicide across the line now. I've been working on that, and I've quipped with them MPs down there that Labour's going to keep on trying to pass that law, or they're going to kill themselves trying. So, a little pre-lunch joke. So, this is a school in 2008. This is a picture from 2018, the year that relationships and sex education was being discussed. This was a little girl, age 6, who has a placard that says, very poorly spelt, "I have a dream that if boys could go, that boys could go to the same toilet as girls." So can you name any 6-year-old who would say that without an educational figure putting that into their head? I've always said that this girl, and she's blocked here, but the picture on the school's website, which I believe is still there, she is not blurred. And it is the picture of propaganda. It is the mainstreaming of LGBT education in UK schools. And that's the reality. You have these types of books being shown to very young children. This is one about Pride in June. It's won awards for the Best Children and Young Adult Literature Award by the Stonewall Group. And you'll find this in places like Tower Hamlets in their school district in London. You have Daddy's Roommate, which shows you, I've always been perplexed by this. I've always thought that this type of education was adults who look at their own morally broke down life and say, we live in a different world, because their world is different, and they want to project this onto kids, and they do it under the guise of preparing them for the future. But at the end of the day, it's just indoctrination. And the thing with RSE in the UK is that there's a tremendous amount of discretion afforded to the individual schools. The only conditions statutorily that they had to fulfill was ensuring that the education was age appropriate and that it had a regard for the religious background of the pupils. The problem is there's no statutory definition of what is age appropriate, and the schools are saying we are the experts and we determine what is age appropriate. And so you have young kids who are sensitive, who come from religious backgrounds, who should never be exposed to this stuff, never mind the other kids who are being exposed to it, who are now being required to see resources from all these LGBT organizations who are coming in and doing training and providing their resources in how to mainstream this type of education through the schools. And at the end of the day, they're graded on it by Ofsted and the other inspectorates, which is a promoting form of making sure that this goes as far as it can go. And you see the statistics. In 2014, the number of young people aged 16 to 24 who identified as bisexual went from 9,400 to 362,000. How does that happen? How does that happen? And this, you see the date, is a little earlier than 2018 when this became the statutory education. So that the triggering act, I've always argued, is the Equality Act of 2010, which came 4 years earlier, which made protected characteristics of sexual orientation and transgender status and required schools to teach and promote this in their education. It's gone so far that the Prime Minister has now called for a review of sex education in schools, because the media every other week was coming out with some insanity of what was being shown to kids in school. And that is ongoing. Before leaving, to their credit, the Conservative government created new draft guidance on how to deal with social transitioning. And it was conservative. And it was actually wonderful. It now says, and it's not in practice yet, because they weren't able to pass it before they left government and gave it to Labour, but it's still the existing guidance that's being consulted on, that you are no longer allowed to use the pronouns of a primary student, the desired pronouns of a primary student. You use their biological markers. They realized that enough was enough. In their safeguarding guidance, keeping children safe in education, they have now said that any child who wants to social transition, the parents need to be informed unless there is some extreme evidence of abuse that occurs with that. Yet, I have a client who's a teacher today. She called me earlier in the week and said, we've been hiding from a Sikh family who's very religious the fact that their 16-year-old is social transitioning. So at school, they're using the pronouns that the child wants to be known by and the name that the child wants to be known by. But for parent-teacher conference, this teacher is now being told she has to lie to the parents. And this is against the law. This is against the law. And this is what schools are still promoting. She said that earlier in the week they had trainers coming in to tell them to ignore the law, saying it wasn't the law yet, when in fact it is the law. So you have also, as part of all this, the celebration of Pride. I don't know if anyone's been to London or anywhere in the UK during Pride Month, but it's a spectacle of rainbows, and as you would imagine, it is taken over the schools as well. So you have Pride marches in schools, you have celebration of Pride Week. They call it School Diversity Week, but that's just it's just a nomenclature for hiding the fact that it's Pride. And is in as many as half of schools across the UK, they'll be celebrating some form of LGBT awareness, including Pride events. We've had reports from teachers and parents across the countries hearing about how these events are being planned, how parents' voices are being subverted, how parents aren't even being told until the events have happened. Izzy Montague was a case that I was involved with, and this goes back to 2018. And her 4-year-old entered a school and was taught without her knowledge about LGBT education, and was forced to participate in a Pride event, a Pride march that the school was taking. The kids were required to, for art class, to make their own flags, make their own rainbow flags that they would be, waving during the celebration. They were taught gay anthems, that you hear at the gay clubs, that they were going to be singing those while they were marching. It was going to be projected on a rainbow projector. An openly gay member of parliament was going to come and speak to them that day. They had two massive rainbow flags, one at the entrance of the school, one behind the kids. And the parents were kept in the dark until the week of. And there was hundreds of parents who didn't send their kids to school that day. We brought a case against the school, and quite shockingly, having the leadership team of that school on the stand asking them simple questions like, what is a woman? Couldn't answer it, wouldn't answer it. Do you think the Catholic position on marriage, and this is a question we asked each of them, is homophobic? Yes. Do you think the Christian opposition and the biblical edicts on homosexuality are homophobic? Yes. These are the kids, these are the teachers, the leaders of our schools who are teaching our kids. And so it's not a surprise when you see this statistic that in 2009, 1 year before the Equality Act, we had only 97 kids referred to gender identity clinics across the UK. And then just 2 years ago, the last time this statistic was taken, during that school year, it was 3,585. That is a contagion in the schools. We've had cases like the Kira Bell case, which was a young girl who was poisoned by this ideology, and actually before the age of 18 got permission to have her breasts removed and hormone treatment, which will leave her unable to have children and permanently scarred. And she brought a case against the NHS and the Tavistock Clinic in London. You had whistleblowers coming out of the Tavistock saying, this clinic is a conveyor belt for transgenderism. The kid comes in questioning, gender confusion, comes out transgender with prescriptions, you name it. And so the Tavistock was closed down. There was a national review of transgenderism in kids, the CAS review, which was done. And the fruit of that was the new guidance. So this is the case of Nigel and Sally Rowe, another client of mine back in 2017, who were told when, and this is on the Isle of Wight, one of the most picturesque places in all of England, were told that when their 5-year-old and 7-year-old went to school, they would now be in class with two boys that they grew up with, because it's a small island, who are now identifying as girls, and if they couldn't accept that, they were transphobic, and the school was going to do everything they possibly could to ensure that the kids would grow up not having those transphobic views. Age 5 and 7. Just shocking. This is some of the material you'll see, the gender unicorn. This is taught literally all over England. It's a bit shocking, all of it. We have the new normal in our primary schools. This was a school book that was taught in Heavers Farm, the school I mentioned. We get a lot of parents who contact us about this book and others like it. And the remarkable thing about gender confusion, we're not allowed to call it, I mean, we call it gender dysphoria now. It used to be gender identity disorder. But if you let kids pass through it naturally, they will, at the end of the day, re-identify with their biological sex because the hormones just have to catch up. But we don't let them. We have the authority figures on a day-to-day basis beat it into them that it's okay to be a different gender than your biological sex. And they're not only supported, they're put up on a pedestal for being so brave to do that. And it's child abuse. It's child abuse, and the American College of Pediatricians has called it child abuse. So conditioning children into believing a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex is normal and helpful is child abuse, and it is child abuse. And the last few things I'll say, the last two cases I'll talk about, it gets a little darker, unfortunately. This philosophy I was talking about dignity and the best interests. You know, I'm Catholic, I read the Bible, and I've recently been reading Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and was surprised to hear the condemnations of Israel, you know, the God's chosen people, that they were sacrificing children to Moloch. And I say that by way of analogy, because we think of the United Kingdom and places in the West like the United Kingdom as promised lands of their own, but they too are sacrificing their children. And this is the case of Alfie Evans, which happened a few years ago. It was a young boy who was born with mitochondrial disease and was rapidly deteriorating. And the hospital he was at, the Alderhay Hospital in Liverpool, who was treating him, went to the Court of Protection because although we don't have euthanasia or assisted suicide in the UK yet, it is practiced through the courts. So it's a way where we don't inject you with something, we just starve you to death. And we don't give you hydration until you die, and we remove life-sustaining treatment. And this was one of those cases. So this was a boy whose parents, Tom Evans and Kate James, and it was a case where they met the Pope and they found their faith, which was nascent because of this. This young boy was accepted to a hospital in Rome, the Vatican Hospital, Bambino Gesù, for treatment. When this case came before the Court of Protection, Tom was representing himself and the family. So Tom is not a lawyer, he was a kid. And he was going up against Queen's Counsel. Now it's King's Counsel, but Queen Elizabeth was still alive then. So a number of Queen's Counsel, these are the top lawyers paid for by the government. They had 6 experts saying that Alfie couldn't breathe for more than 2 minutes, maybe 30 seconds, if taken off the ventilation. That shows up in Justice Hayden's judgment. And Justice Hayden says himself, this is not a life. His best interests are to die, and he won't survive off of ventilation. And the struggle was get him to Rome as quickly as we could. Poland had offered air support. It was all over the media. It was an amazing thing, the situation where you had this elitism that is so present still in the UK versus the working class, which was represented by Tom's family. And the population was just rabid about this case, wanting this child to be sent to Rome. And what happened was that the court order was to remove ventilation and have him die within those 2 minutes. And he lived for 5 days. The doctors were wrong. They were wrong. Yet, so we go back into court saying the doctors are wrong. You got to let him go. There's hope for him. These are his parents. They should be choosing what care he should be getting, and not a judge. And the judge said, well, we may have been wrong a little bit, but not enough to overturn the judgment. We are sending police over to the hospital because there's been too many protesters, and we are going to ensure that without hydration and without food and with heavy sedation that he will pass, and he eventually did. So rest in peace, Alfie Evans. And the last slide is Sadiksha Thirumalesh, who was in a similar situation, except she showed up to the hospital conscious and fought for her life. And this was in Birmingham, and she just passed 2 years ago. And she did her A-levels, so she also had mitochondrial disease. She was fighting it. She was wanting to go to Canada to get experimental treatment, but her hospital also took her to the Court of Protection. There was an anonymity order placed against her, so she couldn't even go out and raise money to go out. No one could know it was her, so she was shouting in the darkness for her life to be saved, and she was speaking, she was writing, she was conscious, and her doctors told her, it's not in your best interest to live, this isn't a quality of life, you can't go to Canada, we're taking you to court, and they did. And interestingly, the two therapists who saw Sadiksha said she had mental capacity to make her own decisions. The hospital, nevertheless, said, look, the fact that this girl can't accept what her doctors are telling her about her condition, that she wants to die trying to live, in her own words, meant that she wasn't mentally capable of making her own decisions. And they found her mentally incompetent and gave her the death order. And she passed away as a result of that. And 2 years later, just recently now, the Court of Appeal overturned that decision posthumously, saying it was a shame and horrendous what they did to her, that she had the right to fight. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I just pray to God that the fabric of morality and Judeo-Christian values that hold this country and Slovakia together stays intact. We need to fight for that, because if we don't, the consequences are horrible. Thank you.